So after he was sent off to prison, it was the first time in my life that I was liberated, and it could not have happened really at a worse time.
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion. We share the inspirational stories of deconversion told by former Christians who are now atheist or agnostic. Our stories remind us we're in it together. They encourage us as we discover who we are and help us to embrace who we become. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
My guest today is an American television network news producer who lives in the heart of Evangelical Christian country in Texas. He's the son of evangelical parents who raised him in the Southern Baptist Church. As hobbies, he enjoys collecting video games and retro video game consoles, and likes to spend some time volunteering at local animal shelters as well. It's my pleasure to welcome James Jackson to the podcast today. James, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
So, how long have you been collecting video games and consoles, and what sparked your interest in that as a hobby?
I guess I started when I was a little kid, actually, and I still have most of my game hardware, at least, and many of the games that I had starting when I was 7 or 8 years old. And I lapsed for a while, kind of toward the end of college, and then in my early post-college adulthood, because I didn't have money to spend on video games. And 8 years ago, I guess, I started getting back into it and discovered I'd really missed it, and to just slowly been building a collection of games and other hardware. Today I have almost 1,000 games in my collection right now, and
wow.
I have not played most of them.
Wow, that's cool. What's your oldest game, or one of your oldest games that you have?
Well, none of them is any older than the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was released in 1985. So yeah, around about 30 years, I guess, would be the oldest.
Cool.
The most valuable item in my collection is a near mint condition, complete in-box copy of the original The Legend of Zelda for the Nintendo. And that has for anyone listening who's familiar with the old Nintendo games, that's the gold cartridge. So
that's cool. So two of my favorites, I got to know if you have. I played mostly sports video games, but do you have Tecmo Bowl or Blades of Steel?
I have both, and I have Tecmo Super Bowl, but it's a unique copy. It's the copy that was released for the Super Famicom only in Japan.
Oh, wow.
So the box has Japanese on it, and a picture of an actor wearing a Dallas Cowboys jersey and helmet. He's not a real player. And the manual is entirely in Japanese, but when you plug the game in, I have a Super Famicom emulation console, and when you plug the game in, it looks just like the American version, and all the text on screen is in English.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, Tecmo Bowl was my game growing up.
Yeah, absolutely love it. It usually had to, when we were kids, we usually had a rule that you couldn't be the LA Raiders because
with Bo Jackson.
Bo Jackson was the most overpowered player in that game.
Yeah, there was like certain plays or players that were like unstoppable, if you yeah, it's really funny. But yeah, so you told me that you consider yourself an atheist but also a secular humanist. So why do you use those terms to describe your beliefs?
I use atheist as a matter of convenience because almost everybody at least knows what it means right away. Well, you don't believe in God. Unfortunately, it's really become a pejorative term in America, and so I don't. There are times when I don't like it because of that, but there's other times where I almost feel like we need to take the word back, and I will proudly describe myself that way. The funny thing is I don't really talk to people about it a whole lot unless they ask. I don't try to be in your face about it because I resent that sort of behavior in Christians, and I don't want to be guilty of doing the same thing. But the atheist is a funny word, because when you break it down into two parts, you have theist, which comes from the Greek word theos, I believe, meaning pertaining to a god, and the prefix a, which is like a opposite or not. So atheist, you're not a theist. You are not a believer in God. And it's unusual in our language in that it's used to describe a state of not being something. We don't have a whole lot of words that do that. The comparison I like to make, and I didn't come up with this myself, but the comparison I like to make, you ask somebody who's questioning you on this, are you a stamp collector? And they say, no, I don't collect stamps. You say, okay, so then I'm going to label you a non-stamp collector. What's it like being a non-stamp collector? What a strange thing to ask somebody, right? So, atheist to me is sort of it is a pejorative. It's a way of classifying a group of people who are a minority. And I think it's a little bit unfair because, we have, especially in present day America, a tendency to marginalize people who don't share our beliefs. And, using that label makes it easy to say, well, that person must not have any morals because they don't believe in God. They're an atheist. I personally prefer the term secular humanist because yes, I'm an atheist, but I'm not super concerned about exploring the day-to-day meaning in my life that I don't believe in God. Just like a Christian doesn't spend much time thinking about why they don't read the Quran, or for that matter, why they don't believe in Zeus or Ahura Mazda or any of the other many pantheons throughout human history.
Yeah.
So I prefer to think of myself in a more positive, active phrase as a secular, meaning free from any metaphysical constraints, humanist, someone who is concerned with the state of humanity and how, at least in my own small way, I can self-monitor my day-to-day activities and make sure that I am, if I'm not that I'm not doing harm to others, and I'm not infringing upon the rights of others to pursue their own happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's in how I just treat people in my day-to-day interactions, or with more passive things like, am I recycling my garbage? Am I, driving less and walking more? Am I turning off the lights? Am I not wasting things? Trying to think outside the self and beyond the self, I think, is the core of, secular humanism as a philosophical way of life, I suppose.
Yeah. That's a good distinction, between the term atheist and secular humanist. And I have similar feelings about, not wanting to be defined by something I'm not,
Right.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and get into just a little bit of your background. So growing up, in what ways was Christianity a part of your childhood?
It was everything. I mean, being from Texas and both of my parents being evangelical Christians, or whatever the equivalent was at the time in the early 1980s. I don't necessarily think that evangelicals or whatever their counterparts were at that time were necessarily the same as they are today. But I have, since learned that my father in particular, throughout my childhood, while he was married to my mother, was very heavily into eschatology, which is sort of a branch of conservative Christianity that is, for lack of a better word, obsessed with the end times. And I did become dimly aware of that probably starting around the time I was 7 or 8 years old, because he read a lot of books on interpreting biblical prophecy and sort of trying to douse when Christ would return and mark the end of days and that sort of thing. He he's still alive and still believes these things. He's a great acolyte of authors like Tim LaHaye, who you may be familiar with from the Left Behind series of novels, and a number of pseudo nonfiction works as well, I guess you could call them. And John Hagee, who is, I can't remember if he passed away recently, but he is or was a really well-known, highly regarded pastor of a megachurch in, I believe, San Antonio, who focused heavily on end times, end of days type prophecies. My mother, when I was an adult, told me that when I was very young, my dad was convinced that my younger brother and I would not graduate from high school before Christ returned to earth. He was referring to a little semi-obscure piece of biblical interpretation that's really fallen out of favor because so much time has passed, that and I forget the exact Bible verse, but that Jesus said something to the effect of, these things shall come to pass before this generation has gone, or something to that effect. And so the interpretation was that once Israel was restored as a nation, which happened in 1948, that generation would live to see the second coming of Christ. And they further extrapolated that a generation meant within 40 years, because in the Old Testament, the number 40 in Hebrew, as you may know, is sort of a generic word for a long time, like 40 days and 40 nights of rain in the Great Flood, or 40 years wandering the desert. So that number had a specific meaning in Old Testament writing. And so my dad believed that Jesus was going to return on or about sometime in 1988.
Oh, that's
and
like
here
Hal,
we are.
That's like Hal Lindsey.
Yes, Hal Lindsey is another author that my father follows.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So did it stress you out, that idea that, as you're growing up, that you may only have a few years until Jesus comes back?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's funny because I haven't really thought about it much until you brought it up just now. But I had a very weird relationship with my faith from a young age. I can remember being 9 or 10 years old and going up to the pastor after church services one day, and I said I had a question for him that they couldn't answer for me in Sunday school. And so he got down to my eye level and said, well, go ahead, son, what is it you want to know? And I said, okay, so the whole world flooded during the Great Flood, and the animals were on the ark with Noah. How did kangaroos get back to Australia after the floodwaters receded? And I don't really remember what he said, but I do remember being very dissatisfied with his answer, because it was, a typical non-answer.
Yeah.
And it's funny that to me now, but at that young age, I was starting to have my first doubts, and it led to tremendous stress and severe, it's really contributed to severe clinical depression that I experienced in my teens and early 20s surrounding, my faith, because I was having more and more doubts about my faith. And, as I got older, and I mean, I would read all these books that my parents gave me on, being a better Christian, and in my dad's case, on prophecy and the impending rapture and the end of the world. And I remember, sometimes having sleepless nights, like wondering, am I doing everything right? Or am I going to be, left behind in the rapture? And am I going to have, and if I am, is there anything I can do to fix it so that I don't go to hell? Like a lot of Christians, I think I was less motivated by the idea of spending eternity with my loved ones than the fear of spending an eternity in torment. And so yeah, I was responding to the threat of punishment more than the embracing love of God as the driving force behind my Christianity. And I think that also led to me taking a very intellectual approach to my faith. I always did very well in Sunday school and then the youth groups as I got older. And for a while I was involved with this sort of quasi Boy Scouts organization. I think it was called Awanas or something like that. But it had
familiar.
Yeah, but it had a much heavier handed religious connotation to it. But, we were supposed to do a lot of reading and memorization and things like that. And I always did very well at it, so much so that, at one point our pastor had talked with my mom and I about, was I interested in going to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary here in Fort Worth? Would I be interested in, pursuing a path if I felt that God was leading me in that direction toward the ministry?
How young were you when that conversation was happening?
I was probably 12.
Oh my gosh. Maybe. Yeah. That is crazy. I was thinking you're going to say like you were like older high school age,
Well, right. That's just it.
That's crazy. They were talking like that at 12. Yeah.
And it was obvious to everyone, I think, that I had a deep interest in the actual text beyond just, reading important verses. Like I wanted to read everything and I wanted to understand it. And I wanted to learn about the Greek and the Hebrew behind it. The other thing that's kind of going off here on the side is my parents had gotten divorced when I was 6 years old.
Okay.
And without getting into too much personal history right now, but my mother remarried, and her second, well, it was her third husband, but the husband she married after my dad was extremely abusive, alcoholic, and so I grew up in a very bad situation as a result of that. And he, of course, was also a very evangelical Christian. And this was where this started to lay the groundwork, I think, for ultimately catapulting myself out of the church.
Yeah, and how much time did you spend with your mom? Like, did you split time between your parents, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I spent about a third of the year with my dad and the other 2/3 with my mom.
Okay.
But so I was getting a different flavor of Christianity from both ends, really. And they were both Southern Baptist, but my dad was more of the fire and brimstone. And my mom's church was for a Southern Baptist church, it was actually, I would not call it liberal or even moderate, but that particular pastor, the focus of his sermons was on grace and mercy and forgiveness, and not too often on, judgment and what is everybody else in the world doing wrong and all their sin and that sort of thing.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's, at least that kind of softens the blow a little bit.
A little bit, sure. But at the same time, because that's the church that my mom and her husband were attending, I was, painfully witnessing every Sunday that her husband, whom I'll call Robert, was, being held up as this exemplary Christian who, led the children's services and who volunteered a lot with the church and helped people with their things around the house and with their vehicles or whatever, and was really beloved and respected. And the other 6 days of the week, I was being victimized by his abuse, as was my brother and his own children, and it was extremely severe. And when he was eventually arrested and convicted of assaulting his daughter, the church rallied behind him. And I was very torn at the time because I had been conditioned throughout this time, and I was about 15 years old at the time. I've been conditioned up to this point, that he was like the master of the household, and that, his word was, basically, I mean, it wasn't in a cult sense, but like he was sort of a mouthpiece for God. He was the God of the household. He, because he was a Christian, and because, the Bible says, spare the rod, spoil the child, and reinforces the patriarchy. I couldn't question any of that. And so I believed that I was obviously a rotten kid, even though, looking back now, I know that I was actually an exemplary kid, and I never got in trouble at school, and I had excellent grades, and I didn't have any friends because I wasn't allowed to have any kind of a life outside of school and church, But when you grow up in that situation, where your life is so tightly controlled, you don't know what the outside world is like, so you don't question it. It's just like, well, this is the way things are.
Right.
There's no reason to think of it would be any differently. And think of how much worse it is for all those kids who aren't getting punished by their parents all the time, because they're going to grow up to be drug addicts and hedonists, and they're all going to go to hell. So, thank goodness that this is the life I have. And then, so after he was sent off to prison, it was the first time in my life that I was liberated, and it could not have happened really at a worse time, because I was a sophomore in high school, and I was dealing with all the social and biological pressures that come with that. And it was just really bewildering and frustrating, and led to gradually increasing levels of chronic depression until I got to college. And then it just, completely, I was really, really overwhelmed, and I stopped going to church.
What was triggering that for you? I mean, obviously he gets arrested and he goes away, and that's traumatic in and of itself. So that, but you said it liberated you. So if you were liberated at 15, 16, why did that liberation then result in depression and just kind of like, I guess, mentally struggling like that?
I think it's sort of a little bit of Stockholm syndrome. When you have your entire life dictated for you, and then very abruptly you're just sort of cut loose. And my mother, who never did any harm, but also didn't intervene on our behalf, she was feeling overwhelming guilt for what we had gone through, and was starting to recognize, that this was her fault. And so she just was spoiling us, my brother and I. I remember that Christmas, she went deep into debt, I now know, but I got everything I wanted. It was ridiculous. No kid that age should, especially at that income level, because we were not well off by any means. But she bought me just every video game I could ever want, and a leather Dallas Cowboys coat that I still own and still wear. That it was that high quality. It was a $200 coat, and just all kinds of stuff. I remember that Christmas, and I know now that that was her way of coping with the guilt she was feeling, was, well, maybe if I do something nice for my boys, that will help. But just combined with being in a very rural community and not having any other outlets, and this is before the internet was really a thing. And so it was, I think that was a big part of the depression, was just simply, the combination of teenage hormones and just having my life completely turned upside down and having absolutely no idea what to do with it. Wow. The other part of it, I think, was that I immediately began to hold a deep, once I could see what had been going on, because I was no longer, being subject to this abuse, I began to get very angry at my mother for not preventing it, and at the church for what I saw as this effectively endorsing it.
Wow.
And then going to college just completely, my freshman year was horrible from an emotional perspective because I had been so sheltered. I mean, we weren't allowed to watch MTV. We weren't allowed to watch The Simpsons. I mean, it was, there really the only TV I had watched up to that point was like the local news and ABC World News and like nature programs and stuff. Like there was so much I didn't know about life and the world, and being just suddenly overwhelmed with all of it. Like I missed an entire decade of music, And I know that sounds like a weird thing, but that's one of the things that stuck with me the most was that because one of the first things that happened after the departure of my stepfather was that I was, I sort of, as I, tried to make some friends at school, they were introducing me to music that I didn't know existed. Nirvana became my favorite band. And because I could relate to it, because, previous to this, all I'd been able to listen to was classic country and oldies.
Wow.
And I was like, I didn't know this existed. And then like 6 months after I bought my first Nirvana album, Kurt Cobain died. So, of course,
oh my God.
but
yeah.
The other, and this is another watershed moment for me, was that a friend of mine introduced me to a band called Bad Religion. And I loved the music. I loved the tonality, and I loved the rawness of it. But I was deeply troubled because I could relate to the message a little too well.
Oh.
And I realized that the message was, you don't need religion in your life. And
Wow.
I liked it so much, and I was so drawn to it, but it was tormenting me inside because I was like, I can't listen to this. I'm going to go to hell. So,
Wow.
Basically, right after I finished high school, I stopped going to church.
Earlier, you had mentioned that you didn't really have a lot of friends outside of church.
Right.
Do you think that was because of kind of the abusive nature of your stepdad?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we weren't really allowed to go anywhere. We weren't allowed to leave the house for any reason, really.
Really? Wow.
Oh, yeah. And, other than to go to church or church activities. And, I mean, my mom has told me much more, more recently about things that I wasn't even aware of. The level of control that both my father and Robert had, that unfortunately my mom was, I forget what the term is, codependent. That's it. Had that codependent personality that she was just drawn to manipulative, abusive, controlling men. And, to the point that, her grocery lists had to be submitted for approval.
Wow.
And anything that wasn't on the grocery list that came home had to be returned to the grocery store because it wasn't approved, that sort of thing.
So how did his actions and that relationship with him affect her faith during that time? Yeah, how did it affect her faith?
It's funny because to this day she remains a deeply committed Christian, but she always responded to everything with some sort of biblical perspective or whatever pastor or author that she was turning to at that time. There was a lot of James Dobson books in our household when I grew up. And that was what she was, that was kind of the what she was following. I didn't really know at much at the time. I didn't read his books except the ones that were geared toward youth. I now know that, James Dobson and Focus on the Family are committed to a interpretation of Christianity which is extraordinarily misogynistic and patriarchal.
Yeah.
And so that my mom made it fit. Obviously that was a good fit for a household that was, overwhelmingly dominated by an abusive type A personality male. And she remarried after that one fairly quickly, incidentally, and is still married to that that gentleman, and I get along with him fine, and he's not abusive or anything. But
So, a couple questions I wanted to ask about some
please.
of this. Yeah. First, I think, how did you mention the church endorsed the abuse by kind of backing him, taking his side? How did that all play out? Like, how did that all play out?
Well, I mean, I went along with the party line. I was, obviously told that he hadn't done anything wrong and that we were being persecuted because of our faith, and that, his daughter had manufactured all these claims. The invented story was that she had done this as retribution because she was grounded after being caught sneaking out with her boyfriend. She was about a year older than me. And so, therefore, again, let's blame the woman, blame the victim, blame, and obviously he couldn't possibly have done any of those things that he's accused of. And I didn't even think of what had been done to me as abuse. I thought of it as good parenting because that's what had been drilled into me,
Yeah.
because the church kind of went along with that and supported him. I mean, at first I remember being willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, like, well, they didn't know the whole story. I guess as time went on and I got older, I came to a couple of conclusions. The first being, why did no one bother to ask, did this really happen? Why was he given the benefit of the doubt? Why didn't anybody, and then eventually I did tell the pastor everything that had happened. And I think he believed me, and I think he was genuinely concerned, but I think he was also concerned with some sort of a schism in the church. It was not a huge congregation. There was probably 50 members. It was a small town. It was the only, at that time, I believe it was the only Protestant church in the town.
What's interesting to me when you say this is I'm thinking his career, his livelihood is bound up in keeping the church together, and keeping the church together is bound up in not kind of pursuing this issue with Robert very much, which is a complete travesty, because here this man is an abusive person, and it should come to light. And, if you're a true Christian, I mean, the way that a lot of Christians are raised, it's, you should be truthful and honest, and people like that should, I don't know, be punished or whatever. Well, but it's just crazy to me that, so he's the pastor is tied into this. He can't be objective about it. He can't really get behind you 100% and say, all right, we're going to support you, James. You know what I mean? He has to kind of walk that balance. It's like a tightrope,
Yes. And I never really faulted him, and I still don't. He's one of the few self-proclaimed Christians that I've ever known who I think actually genuinely lived the good life of a Christian without being an expression of all the bad in it,
Yeah.
And I've known a few people like that, and I'm okay with that, and that's, but at any rate, so the other really big player here was, at the time, I was deeply resentful of and angry at God for letting these things happen to me, and for allowing the church to not intervene on my behalf. And I remember describing how I was feeling privately to a friend without going into much detail about what had happened to me. And I said, and my friend was a devout Mormon, still is, but we could relate to some degree, and on a religious basis. And I said to her, I feel like my thinking of God is that if God is standing here on the side of a road and a child chases a ball into the street and is about to be hit by a car, and God can, stop the car or swerve it or whatever to prevent the child from being hit, but doesn't, how is that, not malevolent? Or I don't remember the word I used at the time.
Yeah.
But I was a teenager and I was coming up with this stuff.
And you were thinking about how that would be evil. It would like, how
Yes.
could a good person, let alone a God who can control everything, just let that thing happen?
Right. And I remember my friend saying to me, "You sound like you're having an existential crisis." And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, it means exactly what you just described. And so when I got to college, I decided that I wanted to minor in religious studies. So I did. And after my first semester, they canceled the religious studies program at my university due to lack of interest. But I kept kind of pursuing it anyway, and studying on my both independently and through college, philosophy and theology. And
yeah, and I want to know all about that. I want to jump back to one more piece of this before, because I do want to get to like when you started doubting and stuff like that.
Right.
But during the time that, I guess your younger years, it sounds like from about the time you were 6 to about 16, in there was when kind of you were raised by Robert and your mother.
Right.
How would you describe your personal relationship with God during this time, growing up?
That's funny because I felt like I didn't have one, and it bothered me. I was mortified by the fact that, and I never really told anybody about this at the time, but that, whether it was during regular Sunday service or in private moments of prayer or studying scripture, I never felt the presence of God. I didn't feel like I had a relationship with God, and I kept trying to have one. I remember, tearfully praying and begging for God to reveal himself to me and to make me feel better. And my self-obsession with this was so bad that whenever I got really sick with a cold or flu or something, I honestly, legitimately believed God was punishing me for not having enough faith.
Wow.
That he had made me sick because I was sinning too much and I wasn't, I wasn't doing the right things. And I would, lay there in bed with a fever or whatever, begging God to cure me and promising to do better. But I never felt a personal relationship with God. I got baptized when I was 10 or 11 years old because I knew that was what my parents wanted.
Yeah.
And they were certainly happy. They were thrilled. But, I didn't feel any different when I came out of the water. I didn't feel any different as I got older. There was this big absence, and I kept wanting to know, what am I doing wrong? Why is God not listening? Why is he not responding? It never occurred to me that maybe there wasn't anybody actually there. The thought, just the mere thought of that was terrifying to me. When I was like a junior, senior in high school, I remember thinking about this and laying in bed and thinking, if I could somehow prove that there was no God, that would mean that there are no consequences for any of my actions, and I could just, go do whatever I want. I could rob a bank and kill a bunch of people. Who cares? What difference does it make? So I kept playing that morality card in order to keep myself in line, I guess.
It kind of, the threat of, when you're told that the whole world falls apart if you start to doubt a little, you just don't doubt. You just avoid it.
Exactly.
Yeah, because it's just too scary to even think about it. And I think hell kind of holds that weight over people too. I mean, you had mentioned that the fear of hell was stronger than the appeal of heaven.
Right.
Yeah. So back to kind of what you were getting into with your college years. So, you've gone through this really difficult, childhood, and then all of a sudden it's almost like you said you were liberated, but in a way it was like, well, what do I do now? Because you hadn't been given any freedom before. And so that caused a lot of difficulties and stuff. So then you start to go to to college and you take a religious studies course, and it sounds like there was some interest on your part to kind of dig into the Bible a little bit. So why don't you just pick up right where you left off when you were talking about that?
Right. So, I'd lapsed in church attendance for a few years, but I still had my Bible, and I still considered myself nominally to be a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point in the early 2000s, while I was in college, so I had been, I'd lapsed. I'd skipped going to church for a few years, and I had, kind of tried to do my thing in college. I wasn't any good at it. Being, social. I joined a fraternity, but I didn't like to drink, and I didn't drink, and I never hooked up with any girls or anything, and so I was still very frustrated socially. And I was hemming and hawing about what I wanted to do next with my life from that perspective. And I ended up encountering one of the professors at the university was also a pastor at a Church of Christ. And, after I completed his course and was no longer a student, I asked him, hey, would it be all right if I came to your church sometime? I'd like to check it out. And he said, yes, of course, we'd love to have you. So I started attending this church. And having been previously mostly with the Southern Baptist Church, it was a pretty easy pivot to Church of Christ, which is also very, very conservative. Probably the biggest difference is that there's, as far as the sermons and things goes, there was no use of musical instruments at all, which is apparently a Church of Christ thing.
Oh, interesting. I've been to churches like that, very rarely, but that is a very interesting belief that they're afraid of, like, rock music and stuff.
Something like that. Yeah. Sort of like, Baptists with dancing, the Church of Christ looks at the Baptists and says, well, you've got a piano. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
So, and this was actually, it was a neat group. It was a very diverse group of people. I had a hard time fitting in. I had a hard time adjusting, but I really, really liked the pastor. And he had some surprising ideas. Like, we would have lunch regularly and talk about my struggles with my beliefs and everything. And I posed the ark and animals question to him. And to my surprise, he said, being a Christian doesn't mean that you have to just completely throw out all scientific evidence. And he says, there's nothing in the Bible that says that evolution didn't happen.
Oh, wow. For him to say that, I mean, that's a conservative denomination, right? You said
for the most part.
Yeah.
But I mean, even right. But even the most famous of conservatives, Pat Robertson, is not a young Earth creationist. And as I learned through this pastor, the way around that was to say, well, the 7 days of creation was probably not literally 7 24-hour cycles. It could have been 7 epochs or, something more. He was willing, surprisingly to me, to take a somewhat more liberal view of interpreting Genesis, whereas I had always been raised in a very strictly, my dad in particular is a biblical literalist, which had always been very troubling for me. And so now here was someone who's willing to say, you know what, maybe God created the world so perfectly that animals could adapt and evolve and adapt to their environment. Isn't that a great thing to think about? And now all of a sudden I'm not so worried about the fossil record, which had been troubling me for a long time.
Right. Yeah. The way you were raised.
Right.
With those beliefs. Yeah.
Sure. And so, so maybe all these things happen. And then at some point after, 7 eons, God created man. And then he was done. Because, when you're an omniscient, omnipresent, infinite being, what's 7 million years, right? So, I can live with that. And he has said other surprising things to me. Like, when I raised the question to him, I said, am I really expected to believe that, indigenous people of the Amazon rainforest who have never been exposed to the New Testament or the Bible have, and live and die their entire lives without ever hearing Christianity, that God sends them to hell? Am I really supposed to believe that a loving God would do that? And my pastor said, personally, I don't believe that. He said, I think that God looks at the heart of a person and judges them on a case-by-case basis. And he said, there's nothing in the Bible that tells me that a truly devout, pious Muslim won't go to heaven. And I said, well, I mean, there's the, verse such and such. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I said, doesn't that automatically disqualify all non-Christians? And his response was, well, it doesn't say that Jesus himself can't make the call. So I liked this guy.
Yeah.
I was like, right on.
You don't have to be a complete jerk to be a Christian.
It really appealed to me. And so I got more and more involved in the church.
And he was a professor at your school as well, you said?
Yes, he taught a religion course. Yeah.
And where you went to school, was that far from where you grew up?
It was in Nevada, but I had...
Oh, okay. So several states away. So, okay.
Sure.
I'm just trying to get an idea of you're on your own, you're in college. Okay, and then you're staying in Nevada after you graduate, and you're going to this church, and this guy's really kind of saying stuff that really makes sense. And
right. Two things happened. The first, there was like I said, this was an unusually diverse congregation. Previously, I'd only gone to all-white churches. This one had Latino families and African-American families in it, and I really liked that diversity a lot. Cool. It appealed to me. And I became friends with an older African-American woman, and we would sit next to each other every Sunday and chit-chat, and, we really hit it off. And then one Sunday I came in and she wasn't there, and she wasn't there the following Sunday. And then 3 weeks later, finally the pastor comes up and announces to the congregation that she had actually died unexpectedly, and nobody had found her.
Oh, no.
And I was devastated. I was like, how could God bring this person into my life and then just abruptly just poof, And then the other thing that happened, oddly enough, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And this was March 2003, I guess. And 2002, 2003, I don't remember. I remember it was March.
Uh-huh.
And I was working in the news business at the time, and so it was obviously occupying a lot of my time. I was very troubled because I had felt very strongly that there was no basis for the invasion, even as I was basically thinking of myself as a very moderate Christian at that point.
And you consider yourself conservative. You grew up conservative politically, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I was in college Republicans. I had voted almost strictly Republican to that point. I had voted for John McCain in the 2000 Republican primary. And when I didn't like George W. Bush, oddly enough, even though he's from Texas. And I had given a protest vote to Ralph Nader, but I had otherwise voted a straight Republican ticket in 2000. I admit this today. Sorry to go off on a tangent.
No, it's good.
Because I lived in Nevada at the time, I very shamefully voted in favor of a statewide constitutional ban on same-sex marriage at the time, because I really believed that was a problem.
Yeah.
I'm glad to know that now Nevada has, even before Obergefell, Nevada was one of the first states to legislatively correct that. And I am happy about that. And I have admitted, to my LGBT friends now that yes, when I was younger, I was on the wrong side, and I use it sort of as an example of, that people can come around and change their opinions, and their beliefs. But at any rate, so the invasion of Iraq happens, and I was really unhappy with the way things were going, which, today looks like a walk in the park, but the pastor and I had become pretty close. One of his sons was active duty, and he was getting deployed to Iraq. And the pastor had told me privately that, while he loved his son and supported him in whatever he did have reservations about the American invasion of Iraq, understandably.
Wow.
Notwithstanding the fact that his son's life was being put at risk. And he was an
Right.
officer. He was like a lieutenant or something, so I don't think he was going to be in combat or anything. And
Okay.
of course, there were very few American casualties in that first invasion, but that's
Right.
another story. That, maybe a week or two later, one of the deacons went up to the front of the church, kind of before the sermon, just going through announcing everything. And he was talking about all the members of the church who had family who was being called up or, sent off to Iraq or whatever. And I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something to the effect of, if you're not behind this and you don't support this, what our president is doing, then you don't belong here.
Whoa.
And I was so angry that somebody would turn a church service into a political statement that I very quietly got up and I left before the sermon even started, and I never went back, and I didn't return any of my pastor's phone calls or texts. I just I'm done.
Wow.
No more.
That was a deacon who said that?
Yeah, it wasn't even the pastor. It was like,
wow.
I was like, this is why I left the church before. And I thought that this was a more, open-minded group, but yeah, I was infuriated.
Wow.
And so I stopped going, and a couple of years passed, and I was, gradually having a harder and harder time with coping with depression and my, confused point of my faith. And so when I was about 27 years old, I pulled out my Oxford annotated Bible, which was very, very large, thick book. And the top half, if you've never seen an Oxford annotated Bible, the top half of each page is the original scripture from the New King James translation into English. And the bottom half is footnotes for every single verse written by respected theologians from Oxford University in the United Kingdom. And so I said, I'm going to read this book. I'm going to read the Bible from Genesis 1 to the end of Revelation on my own. I don't want a pastor telling me what to think of it. I'm not going to use a guidebook or something like I'd always done before. I want to read this myself and look at what has been written in these notes by these experts who've been following it. I want to read the Bible on my own and come to my own conclusions. And so I did. Over the course of about 8 or 9 months, I read through the entire Bible from start to finish. And, spoiler alert, long before I got to the end, but really, like halfway through, I was starting to have really serious doubts, and I was getting very confused and frustrated. But when I finished the Gospels, before I finished the rest of the New Testament, but really when I finished the Gospels and I saw how it had been sitting in front of me all these years, the contradictions, the, irreconcilable contradictions in the text, and the substantial problem of the two gods, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, who seem to have nothing in common with one another. And the fact that it was clear to me that there was a great deal of Old Testament law that was being ignored by Christians out of the sake of convenience, and that things were being cherry picked, and that there were all these things in there that had never been taught to me. But really, by the time I got done with the Gospels, and certainly by the time I was finished with Revelation, I concluded, I am no longer a Christian.
Wow.
I cannot believe this.
And that took several months. Did you say 9 months it took you to read through it, the whole thing?
8 or 9 months. I would say
that's
at the
still
end,
pretty darn good. That book, I mean, that's hard reading. to sit down and be like, all right, cover to cover, I'm going to do this. I mean, that's right. Tough stuff.
It took a while. And
how much time went by from the time that you left that church until you picked up the Bible and
That was about 3, maybe 4 years.
Okay, you may have said that, and I just missed it.
No,
But
I don't think I did.
did you ever try to reach out to that pastor again? Did you
No.
wonder? No?
I did wonder a little bit.
Yeah, like maybe he wanted to clarify, hey, I didn't agree with what that guy said, or something like that.
No, I just needed to get on with my life.
It was just too much.
I was like, God, I've given you every chance in the world to reveal yourself to me, and you just keep making it harder and harder and harder for me to believe in you. Give me something. And I remember praying before I started my, Bible journey, reveal yourself to me through these words.
Yeah.
And when I was done, I was like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. But that was not my atheist moment. I would say I was at worst, for lack of a better term, an agnostic at that point.
Well, it doesn't ever happen usually like really quickly. So you'd read through the Bible. Were there certain parts of the Bible that stood out to you when you read them? You were like, "What? This is I can't accept this," or "Oh my God, that's crazy. Why did no one tell me that?"
Well, easily the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, attributed to Moses. Because first of all, with Genesis, it was abundantly clear to me for the first time that there was a lot more going on here than I'd been led to believe.
Yeah.
It was very clear to me, and I independently observed that there were at least two distinct creation stories. That didn't make any sense to me. But here's the difference. Before, when I had been exposed to all this, it was just, as a person going to church and just take it at face value. Now I had this thing called the internet, and I could look it up. And I learned that, yes, biblical scholars say there are at least 2 creation stories from 2 separate independent sources. Wow. And here's how we think that they were pieced together from these oral traditions and here in this document, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so on and so forth. And I started to learn what, theologians and secular scholars had to say about these curious things like, okay, was Adam and Eve created at the same time, or was Adam created first and then Eve created from his rib bone? Because both of those are described in there. And then what happened on the 4th day? Was it the birds or the fish? Because and that was, even though that sounds like, very ticky-tacky stuff, it really troubled me because I'd been raised as a biblical literalist. Yeah. And it's like, if this is the inspired word of God, how could it possibly contain errors? Right. That's a huge problem. And then continuing through the Old Testament and reading about the deeds of the the people that I'd grown up believing were biblical heroes: Samson, David, Solomon, Abraham, and reading that they were literally raping women to impregnate them, and that they owned slaves, which had never really been pointed out to me before. And coming to the realization that, holy bleep, this book is endorsing slavery.
Or like Solomon, 300 wives and 700 concubines. I mean,
right.
It's
like they gloss over that, and they don't really get into all that detail in church. It's like, well, yeah, but he built the temple, and it's like, wait a minute, how is this okay? Why is this being presented just very matter of factly? David sent out his best general to the front lines so he could get killed, so David could have an affair with Bathsheba.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, because David's venerated. I mean, he's
right.
He's a hero.
Right. He's the and Abraham was the story of Abraham and Isaac. Which when you're a kid, it's literally presented in colorful children's Bible picture books. Like, here's Abraham and Isaac going up the mountain, and God says, you need to sacrifice him. He's like, okay, I'll do whatever you say, God. And Isaac is just totally going along with this. Yeah. He's like, all right, I get to be sacrificed. Hooray. And then God says, hold on, Abraham, you passed the test. Here's a ram that's caught in a thicket. You can sacrifice that instead. Yay, okay. I didn't know as a kid, I didn't think about that. And now I'm reading as an adult, and I'm horrified. I'm like, God literally told him to murder his own child. What was going through that kid's head? If,
Right.
Assuming this was based on fact, which obviously
Right.
it wasn't. But, if you do that in the Bible and you're venerated as a patriarch, you do that today and they put you in prison. It's like the old saying. I heard someone say once about George W. Bush, because he said that he believed God speaks to him every day. It's someone said, if he said, I believe God speaks to me every day through a hairdryer, we would have impeached him and put him away. But no, simply by saying, I believe that God speaks to me, oh, okay, that's fine. And I started to really realize as I was going through this project, the reason that I never heard God speaking to me is that either he's not there or he's not who I've been led to believe he is.
Wow.
But I still couldn't wrap my head around a universe from nothing
Yeah.
and a prime mover. And I also believed that because I had suffered so much in my life to that point, that I found comfort, oddly enough, ironically enough, in the belief that there was a malevolent deity who may have inspired. This is literally where I kind of found myself as an agnostic. I was like, if there is a God, he is a malevolent deity that inspired the religions of the world, which is why they have so much in common. And maybe he created everything, but he is not looking out for our best interests.
Wow.
That was the best. That was as close as I could come. But I remembered, after a while thinking, I really need to cut my ties with Christianity. I can maybe, take on some form of self-created philosophical deism, but I can't do this Christian thing anymore. And I remembered thinking, like, thinking back to some of the stuff I'd read and things I'd been told about, the unforgivable sin, denying the Holy Spirit,
Right.
And so I said, let's make this official. And I was in my bedroom by myself and on like a summer day. And I said out loud, I deny the existence of the Holy Spirit. I deny the divinity of Jesus Christ. If there is a God, it's not the way it's described in here. I renounce it fully, and I renounce my Christianity permanently. I had to do that, and that was the first spiritual experience I had in my life. Seriously, Steve.
Wow.
That was the closest I ever came to having a feeling of spirituality.
You know what's cool? When I hear you say that is I feel like you were taking your life back. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you'd been like constrained and in an abusive home, and you were sort of liberated when that guy went to jail, but then like you were pretty much left on your own to try to sort through all this stuff. And there was confusion and sorting through doubts and this pastor, and then these things that happened with the lady passing away, and then the war, and just all this crazy stuff's going on. And then you basically sit down with the Bible and start going through it, and like I'm gonna figure this out for me, and then come to your conclusion, and it's like, damn it, I'm not gonna do this anymore. Right. I know who I am now.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that, like I said, I still sort of I really was an agnostic at that point, and very ambivalent about it. I was very nervous about ever telling my family because I didn't want to be completely rejected by my parents and my grandparents, who I was very close to, my grandparents, that is. And so I just kind of kept it all to myself. I never talked to anybody about it at all. And nothing else really happened with it. I just kind of went on with my life.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the summer of 2009, I met our mutual friend, Melissa, who, interestingly enough, was kind of going through the same thing at the time, in that she was a lapsed Christian, but she still kind of sort of had a little, thread of that belief still.
Mm-hmm.
And neither of us had really gotten all the way there. But we are the best of friends. We're very close now. And as our friendship developed over the following, years, we started talking about our beliefs and things more and more and exchanging books. And the two books that changed my life, which one, I believe, I can't remember if one of them was a gift from Melissa or they both were. Actually, there were three. There was The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, Letter to a Christian Nation by Sam Harris, and God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah, James, just real quick, those are probably my top three for me personally. That's really cool to hear you say that.
Here's how I approached those. I read all three of them consecutively within about 6 months. And that was the tipping point for me, was hearing Dawkins give the scientific explanation as to the belief and where it comes from. Hitchens giving the most well-constructed and really sharp criticism of organized religion that I'd ever been exposed to up to that point. Mm-hmm. And then tying it all off with Sam Harris giving you Christians don't have a monopoly on morality. Like, it's an incredible coincidence, and I can literally say it is just a coincidence. Well, it's not a coincidence, because all these three authors were, they were and are the kind of forefront of, so-called new atheism. And that once I got through that point, which was mid to late 2010, that was when I finally came out and said, I don't need to believe in anything metaphysical anymore. I don't have to understand everything in the universe just to be okay with, with the way things are in existence. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean that it has to have a God explanation for it.
Yeah.
And that opened up a whole new world for me, and I finally, started getting caught up on all the science that I'd missed out on for the first 25, at that point, 30 years of my life.
Wow. Yeah, that was very similar for me in discovering. For me, it was geology. I got really into that, but evolution a little bit too. But yeah, it's crazy. It's like you've been sheltered from science so much that all of a sudden it opens up this whole new world to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Was there anything in particular that really caught your interest at that time?
I could not get enough of literature about evolution and astrophysics. And I started reading Lawrence Krauss, A Universe from Nothing.
Oh, cool.
I referred to that title earlier. Fantastic book. If anyone out there is listening, I know that how troubling it can be to think of the creation of a universe without a so-called prime mover. It's one of the principal arguments for religious apologists. Read A Universe from Nothing, and you will get a better understanding of how physicists can explain the fact that we exist at all, and that we may have come from a state of non-existence. It's really fascinating stuff. It doesn't answer every question that I had, but it gave me a lot of peace of mind that, like, these are solvable problems. And how fortunate we are to live at a time, even in the existence of the universe, where we can understand that, because about 1 trillion years from now, or maybe even a few 100 billion, I don't know the number, but the stars and galaxies will have, as we approach entropy, will have moved apart such great distances that an observer on a theoretical Earth far into the future would not be able to see cosmic background radiation with any measurement, because objects will have moved so far apart that they're greater than the speed of light can ever reach them.
Wow.
So, an observing race in the distant future would be forced to conclude that they were literally alone in the universe, or that the universe is much smaller than we know it to be. And we're very fortunate to exist at a time where we can still see an observable universe. Things like that. It's like that you won't even consider or give a second thought to when you're a believer, I guess. No, I don't want to pigeonhole all believers into that, but when
Right.
you think that your faith is the end all be all, and that there's no need to be curious because who cares? God did it. That answers everything.
Yeah.
Why wonder about anything? Why worry about anything?
So this was happening. You'd graduated, but were you still in Nevada though?
No, I had moved back to Texas
Okay.
sometime earlier.
And that's when you started reading through all these books. And were you living at home with your parents at all, or your mom or
No,
dad, or?
no, I actually have not lived with my parents at all since high school. But
Yeah.
I owned my own house in Texas and I lived there when the journey started. And I had
Okay.
actually moved to Georgia and taken a position with CNN at that time, and that was when I hit the, okay, now I'm an atheist,
Yeah.
that I was living there. I had not lived there very long, I recall, when I really finally cleared that hurdle mentally.
So what
And go ahead.
so what I'm wondering is, when all this happened and you were like, okay, I've read the God Delusion, Letter to a Christian Nation, God is not great. I've read this, Universe from Nothing book, and you've decided, okay, like, I'm on board now. Was there anyone in your family around that you felt like you should tell, or do they know about these doubts you had or have?
Oh, I was terrified of the thought at first. I didn't want him to find out.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I share that. I understand how that feels. That's horrible.
Yeah. After a while, it didn't bother me so much, but a few times a year, I would think, I really want to tell my parents. And again, it would be telling them separately because, they've been divorced for more than 30 years.
Right.
But and I knew they would handle it differently. I knew my father would become extremely angry and would probably have, cut me off. And I thought my mother would be deeply distressed and hurt and upset. And so every time I revisited it in my mind, like, I really want to talk to my parents about this, but should I? The great thing about, being a non-believer, a secular humanist, whatever, is there's no evangelizing imperative. There's no diktat that we should spread the good news that there is no God. We don't have to do that. And in fact, this is where I differ a lot from many so-called new atheists, in that I am not fond of publicly condemning and criticizing religion for its own sake. I don't think that does anyone any favors. I don't like the disrespect of faith that a lot of your new atheist types have. I differ a little bit, particularly from Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins in that regard. They're not as bad as like a Bill Maher, who literally goes out and tries to ridicule people. But my attitude is, you just put people on the defensive and you make them even less open to learning. Well, why do you not believe in God? And asking, they're not going to ask those questions if they think you're just going to taunt them and call them stupid.
Right.
And because I've been there, I understand that. And I look at my mother, who is a very sweet and loving person, and I think, for all that she's been through in her life and health problems and other things, her faith gives her hope that someday she'll be reunited with her parents and other loved ones in heaven. And why should I try to deny her that? If her life is better because of her faith, then would it be, categorically good, if we can even use that label, for me to, approach her and say, I don't believe any of this and I think it's wrong? Is that, what have I accomplished there?
Right.
And so I continuously come to the conclusion that there's no reason for me to tell my mother. Um, Incidentally, earlier this month, I did finally come to I did finally tell my father, but it was sort of part of a much bigger coming out in dealing with, all of the years of emotional abuse that I had been subject to from him. And quite honestly, I'd been putting up with it because I still wanted access to my grandparents. Well, my grandfather passed away several years ago, and although my grandmother is still alive and living with him, she is so far gone with dementia that there's nothing really left there anymore.
Yeah.
And I was just involved in another difficult situation with my dad, and I'd finally come to the point I was like, I can't deal with this anymore. And so I finally told him, I was like, you know what? This is what's really going on. This is what's been happening, and you have been mistreating me, abusing me, and manipulating me emotionally for my entire life, mostly on the basis or largely with the reinforcement of your frankly perverse faith, and I don't want a part of it anymore. And so, that was it. I mean, that was a long time coming.
Wow.
And so I don't speak to my dad anymore. I hadn't talked to him in about a year before that anyway. And so, and I knew that, but we were never close, and it was just one of those things that the stress of trying to maintain a relationship with him had finally gotten to be too much. So that's kind of how I dealt with it with my parents. The only family member that I've ever talked to it about openly is my mother's sister, who I'm very close to. And I learned to my surprise from her that one of my mother's other sisters is also an atheist, or calls herself. But beyond that, I look at it as like, it's something that, again, it describes a little bit of who I am, but it's not everything that I am.
Right.
So I don't like, go broadcasting it everywhere, and I don't share a bunch of social media posts about those types of things, because I don't want to alienate people. And, and I certainly don't dismiss or look down on anybody who does do that. I mean, like, what you're doing is great because it gives, I do recognize the importance of letting other non-believers know that they're not alone.
Yeah.
And especially in a place like Texas, one can feel like that quite a bit, where it's not just a cultural thing, it's literally a legal thing, where there are efforts in the current Texas legislature, as there are every year, to further and further reinforce official government-sanctioned Christianity. That's the biggest challenge that I deal with in my, day-to-day life, is the fear of my state and eventually my country becoming so hostile to non-belief that it becomes a liability.
Yeah. So what would you say is the most difficult, or what was the most difficult thing during the time that you were deconverting? So I'm kind of going back a little bit, but from the time that you read the Bible to on your own to, up to what we've been talking about, where, you're telling your dad that, you don't believe in that faith, that, his perverse faith anymore. What was the most difficult thing during that time?
Coming to terms with two things. First of all, really shaking myself free of the notion that I was going to hell. It sounds funny, but actually, even when I was a kid, the thought of spending eternity in heaven was not a great deal more positive to me than hell.
Yeah.
The options were eternal torment or eternal boredom. And I really, I couldn't, because every description of heaven that I'd ever heard or read, it sounded dreadful to me. Like you just eternally praising God over and over and over again. Won't we get bored after a while? how do we cope with that? Well, there's no male, there's no female. Okay, so what are we going to do? Are we and there's the popular culture depiction of heaven with, people sitting around with wings and halos or whatever, and, golfing or what, I don't know,
just doing their
playing with
favorite
dinosaurs.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, and spending time with their loved ones. And I'm like, that's not what the Bible says at all. That's not, and beyond that, again, backing up a little bit, but one of the term papers I wrote in my college religion courses was about the discovery I made in that class that had never really been presented to me before, that the Old Testament has absolutely no mention of an afterlife, period.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Most Christians don't realize that. If you tell a Christian the Old Testament has nothing to say about heaven or hell, it's a non-concept. And if you talk to a Jewish person, they'll agree with you. Yes, we don't have a heaven or hell. They have the closest they have is Sheol, the grave, in which the worst thing to be is forgotten about. That's it. There was no, heaven and hell. And this was another, in my later extra biblical research, when I learned about the influence of Persian Zoroastrianism on the early biblical writers, and the dualism of, God versus Satan, that was all much later inventions that are not found anywhere in Judaism. And but yeah, so it was it kind of extrapolating on that point. One of the most difficult things, and it remains the most difficult thing to this day, really, is coming to terms with the fact that bad people are not being punished. Guess what? Hitler didn't go to hell. Anybody you can think of that has done terrible things to you or to humanity got away with it, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
That there is no final moral judgment. That is and I will openly admit that to anybody who calls me on it. I'll say, yes, I am forced to admit that there is no justice for the wicked. Saddam Hussein is not being eternally tormented in hell right now. And that's just the way it is. So if you want to believe that, bad people who do that got away with it, then fine. But you know what else? You can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So
I just think for humanity, it's we're drawn to believe in a just world. We're so drawn to it that we'll believe in it even if it's clearly not true.
And it's the basis of every modern major faith except Judaism. Whether you're talking about karma in Buddhism and Hinduism, or hell, Hades, whatever in Islam and Christianity, it appeals to our sense of justice.
So it was this idea of hell that was the hardest for you to kind of shake, the concern that you were going to go to hell.
Right.
Yeah.
Even more than coming to terms with the fact that I'm not going to see my loved ones again.
Wow.
I'm not going to see my grandparents or any of my friends who have died, or my dogs or anything like that. That, accepting the finality of death is it's a little bit of a challenge, but maybe less so for me than some other people. But yeah, more than anything, I think is just the like, oh my goodness, so and so is not going to go to hell when he dies, and that is really disappointing. But it also encourages me to not think vindictively. Even after I go back and forth all the time on various issues, and so I don't, align completely with a lot of progressives and atheists on some things. I still go back and forth on the death penalty. I've been from the, it should be banned in all circumstances to, why not? And now I fall somewhere in the middle, like, well, it doesn't seem to do a very good job of preventing crime and or of punishing people, but you can't deny that dead persons can't commit crimes anymore. So,
Yeah. I was going to tease you. Well, you are from Texas, so.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's the funny. It's like here, it's one of those things that like I don't give much thought to because it's like if you want to live in a democratic society, you have to abide by the will of the majority a lot of the time, and there's no hope of repeal of a death penalty in Texas anytime soon.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, and these issues I think are good debates to have. Secular debates.
Yes.
I actually think it's really good for the atheist and agnostic community to diversify, not just, like along race lines or whatever, but like in the way that we think politically. At the moment, most atheists and agnostics I know are liberal leaning or moderate, but I do know a few that consider themselves libertarian, or they would say maybe independent or something. And I think it's important to not all fit into one, it shouldn't be that way. I think the sign of a healthy kind of group or whatever is that there is a diverse views and that you can have these debates. I think it's good not to fit into just exactly everything that every liberal atheist before us has believed,
Right.
Otherwise, my God, that just sounds like exactly what we came from, Christianity, like here's the way you're supposed to live. This is the party that you vote for,
Right. And that concerns me. Again, in what I see sometimes with, so-called new atheism, is, wanting everybody to fall into lockstep is dangerously problematic.
Yeah.
That we have to have room for a broad spectrum of opinions, and we have to, I think, be much more sympathetic to the reasons that people adhere to their faith. And, I get very annoyed when I see, even though I am an ardent supporter of the ACLU and Americans for Separation of Church and State, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and other similar groups, I get annoyed when I see them spending a lot of time fighting over a cross in a public park or, things like that it's not really doing any harm. It's, I'm much more concerned with, keeping religious doctrine out of public education.
Yeah.
I don't get too worked up if the city council wants to have a Christian prayer before they meet because they're probably mostly, at least nominally, Christian. That's fine. I don't care. It's a traditional thing. It's a cultural thing. But I feel like too much energy is spent on confronting those when we have far more serious and consequential issues that now more than ever require our full attention and energy to combat.
Yeah. So during your time of deconversion, was there something that you feel like helped you the most?
Definitely having my best friend Melissa there as a support, because she was going through it at the same time too. Having somebody there to talk to about it, that was absolutely essential. There's so few. I mean, it's you now have the internet, and you can just Google I think I forgot to mention this before, but one of the most helpful websites that I found when I was exploring this idea of leaving my faith was, it had some silly URL like why won't God heal amputees?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, and it asks a very simple question: why won't God heal amputees? And then it asks the reader to explore this question through a series of posts and links and things like that. And so having the resources like that was immensely helpful, but it really meant a lot more to have somebody to actually speak with and talk to and challenge and not necessarily be stuck in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
For it to develop organically, which it did for me, and which again is why I say, non-believers don't need to evangelize, because it will just happen on its own to anybody with the right amount of curiosity and, crucially, access to information.
Yeah, but having that person or people to talk to about things that are going through your head, doubts, questions, feelings
Right.
about this whole process is really important. So it's
Right.
good that you had someone to bounce these things off of,
Yeah. And it can be scary asking people about that. I remember being cautious and timid about talking even to Melissa about it at first, because, you don't want people to just reject you or blow you off, whatever. I've experienced that very recently. I made kind of become friends with somebody I worked with, and we were hanging out a lot. And I had lunch with her and her husband one day, and they were just, talking about all their church activities and stuff and asking me about my faith. And I was very open about my lack of it. And, we don't hang out anymore since then. I don't
Wow.
know. Was that because of it? I don't know. I mean, she's still cool to me at work. I don't have any problem with her. That's
Yeah.
fine. But I have to wonder,
Right.
and so, yeah. And I don't worry about it at my current job or previously, but there are certain environments that you could encounter some real hostility by being open about your lack of faith.
Yeah.
And even though it's one of those things that's impossible to prove, I could just lie,
Yeah.
and I don't care. There are no consequences. But
Yeah. Yeah, that's always the option. I mean, that went through my head too. Just
yeah,
fake it, But
right.
for the Christians in your life that know you've deconverted, what's the biggest misunderstanding that they have about your deconversion?
That's a great question. I would say that most of the Christians in my life don't really know. And the handful who do don't talk to me about it. And I just kind of let it be,
Yeah.
I do remember that sometime after college, shortly after I finished college, I went to a wedding in Nevada. Uh, well, I went to a wedding of a friend from high school, close friend from high school, and one of our teachers was there, and he had apparently always been a devout evangelical Christian, but to his credit, he never said anything about it in school.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were sitting at the table, with guests or whatever, and a few of my friends from high school and this teacher, and he was, just really going off on his Christian message and was asking everybody about their faith and everything, and came to me.
Wow.
And this was before I had, really completely abandoned it. And I just kind of hemmed and hawed. I didn't really want to talk about it. And he very flatly called me out and said, "I don't think you're a true Christian, James. You don't,
Wow.
you don't seem to have any pride in your faith. You need to get right with God." And da, 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 da. And I was humiliated and angry and embarrassed, and I didn't know what to say. And I thought about that day a lot over the years, and how much I wish I could confront him, or that he would confront me again if I was to encounter him, because I would be much better prepared for that.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, my dad asked me something, like, just completely caught me off guard. He asked me when I was visiting him for holidays, said, "Do you like books about prophecy?" And I was like, I didn't know how to answer, because I did not want that moment right there,
To be the
to
moment that he finds
that,
out.
like, actually, yeah. So
Yeah, not only do I not want to
I
read books
just,
about prophecy, but
yeah, it's like, no, not really. And he's like, "What? Why not? Are you not reading the Bible?" And I was like, "Yeah, what?" And it's like, "Do you still believe?" I was like, "Yes." It was terrible. It
yeah.
was so awkward and embarrassing and frustrating. And I was very angry at myself for a while afterward. It's like, I didn't have the courage to stand up for myself, but on the other hand, I didn't want to create a scene, and because I knew that's what would happen. And so, yeah, it's funny, but it just doesn't come up really
Well,
with
that's
my
yeah.
my friends and peers. It's just like they'll occasionally talk about church or faith or whatever. And, just the other day, somebody was saying, "I see that they're running this program on CNN called Finding Jesus, and I'm really interested in it." And I was like, "Yeah, it's not new. did that a couple of years ago, and she was like, "Oh, well, I'm not really devout anymore, but I still believe, and so I'd like to see what it's all about." And I was like, "Okay, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the extent of our of religious conversations at work." And I think it's because, most people that I know I met through my job, and they know better than to bring it up in the workplace.
Yeah.
Or so yeah, occasionally somebody will ask about it and be like, "Yeah, I'm an atheist. I don't believe," and then be like, "Oh, okay." And that's it. I haven't really encountered any hostility. I'm
That's
very
really
fortunate.
good. Yeah. You're fortunate. Yeah.
Yeah. But again,
Mhm.
I don't bring it up online. I don't, my Facebook presence, if you were to like scrutinize my Facebook or Twitter feed, you wouldn't know one way or the other. I
That's
just I remain agnostic about my atheism online.
there you go. Oh, that's funny. I know someone who refers to themselves as an agnostic atheist. So it's you know what I mean? Like we all have different ways of describing our belief, and that's funny. How
Yeah.
so going through deconversion is a huge change, as you know. What about you stayed the same through that whole process?
I think my intellectual curiosity remained the same. The same thing that had me wanting to read more of the Bible and learn more about it, and to read those, when I was younger, those books about prophecy that were, presented to me, and wanting to learn more about other faiths too, which I was initially told was dangerous.
Yeah.
Um, and because I grew up in a community that actually had a pretty large Mormon presence,
Hmm.
Latter-day Saints Church. And so it was something that was a little weird to me, because on the one hand, I was being told at church, uh, you know, Mormonism, as they would call it, is a cult. It's not really Christian, and they, have all these crazy, wacky beliefs. But that was contradicted by the fact that I had friends who were Mormon, and they seemed like really nice people. Um, so yeah, that whole intellectual curiosity that served me so well that's definitely not changed.
That's a great
Uh,
answer, and you started the interview with talking that story about how you went to the pastor and asked him about kangaroos, and
yeah,
it's kind of cool how as a young child, these thoughts are there, and that was just kind of a glimpse into your personality and something that would stick with you for your whole life.
yes. Sadly, the other thing that stayed with me is my general cynicism and uh, dim view of humanity. That has definitely not changed.
When you think back on the Christian you, what do you think about that person?
I think he was very confused. And I don't think, this is going to sound kind of strange, but looking back now, I don't think I ever really was a Christian. I don't
Hmm.
think I ever really truly believed any of it. I think I was paying lip service because that was what my family wanted. And I just didn't understand it until I was an adult.
Wow. What do you like best about being an atheist or a secular humanist?
I like the intellectual freedom to question everything and to be skeptical and to seek out my own answers. And I like being able to change my mind based on new evidence.
That's cool. Name one thing that you learned or experienced that you may not have if you were still a Christian.
American pop culture since 1996. As far as the evangelical side of it goes, I would not have nearly as many friends and associates as I do now,
Wow.
because I've been able to, I will tell you right now, my closest friends in the world are an atheist, an agnostic Jew, and an Arab Muslim. And that would not have been possible. I would not have associated with any of those three. And they're my closest, my four close friends in the world. The fourth is a Buddhist. I would not have formed friendships with any of those people if I was still a committed Christian. And that means everything. They mean everything to me.
Because as an evangelical, you're told not to basically mix with those people, not to, unless
Not
you're
only that, but you
evangelizing
judge them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not only that, but A, I have an imperative to convert them, and B, they are inferior to me because of their ridiculous beliefs or lack thereof.
Yeah.
Or in the case of Jews, you as a Christian, you just feel sorry for Jewish people.
Right, like they had it and then they lost it. Yeah.
Right.
Here their Messiah came and they didn't recognize him.
Right.
Jeez. That's a cool answer though. Like friends. And I think there's a lot of truth in that for a lot of people who've deconverted, because it is isolating. Religion can be very isolating. Ironic as that sounds, and I know sometimes losing the religious community makes you isolated, but religion itself isolates you from, the other, or people who are outside of that church or that circle or that denomination or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you think about your deconversion experience, what are you most proud of?
I'm proud that I reached my own conclusions independently and without being led to them by another person or entity. That I discovered it organically, as I said before, on my own.
That's cool. That's awesome. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that you want people to know about or that you want to talk about?
I think we've hit pretty much everything. I just would encourage again that I think all people who identify as atheist, agnostic, secular, humanist, or deist questioning, all need to, I think we need to lighten up on how we treat people of faith and have a little bit more respect for not necessarily the faith itself, because while there's plenty of merit to the various religions and faiths, there's certainly a lot of problems, but that doesn't mean that we need to focus on it and tell people that they're wrong and that they're stupid or they're somehow inferior. I think we need to have a lot more respect for why people have faith, and we need to do everything we can to encourage an open and civil dialogue among all faiths, because now more than ever, the right just to believe or not to believe in the West is seriously threatened, not just in the United States, but throughout Latin America and Europe right now. There is an inexorable tie between nationalism and religion, whether it's Christianity in America and Europe or Islam in the Middle East and North Africa. And I think we would serve ourselves and all of humanity a lot better if we focused on getting along and having honest discussions about faith and treating everyone with respect and guaranteeing some measure of equality, because it's like I heard a French philosopher say this not too long ago, is you can have a society of liberty, of absolute liberty, or of absolute equality, but you can't have both.
That's really thought-provoking.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. So just a real quick follow-up question on that. So what's the point where, you said that we should respect Christians and their beliefs, not necessarily the faith itself, but,
right,
respect why they believe. Is there a point, in your opinion, where someone should speak up and maybe confront a belief someone has? Is there any scenario where you could imagine yourself saying, I respect this person's beliefs, I respect that they have faith for a particular reason, but this can't go unchallenged, or this can't go without me standing up and saying, hey, saying something
right
about it. Yeah. Is there ever a scenario where you think that's appropriate?
Yes. It's like the saying goes, the right to my fist ends where your nose begins. And we do have to look out for those tenets of religion that threaten basic individual human freedoms. And we do have to speak up about them. We have to speak up when the supposed rights of Christians are directly infringing on the absolute civil rights of Muslims and LGBT persons. We do have to speak up when the rights of women and children in fundamentalist Christian and Muslim households are jeopardized. But at the same time, we have to have very difficult discussions about individual rights. I struggle constantly with the question of the hijab. Because to me, the hijab is a symbol of misogyny and of holding women down as inferior to men.
Yeah.
But to many Muslim women, it is an expression of their faith and their desire not to be objectified. That's a difficult question. But there are some matters where I think we can reach agreement that, clearly we have to stand up and challenge religious authority when it comes to the education of our children and the right to think and speak freely and independently. And whenever faith challenges those, which is unfortunately quite frequently, because independent thought is the number one enemy of faith and religion. When we see that the ability of individuals and the vulnerable, young people, the poor, the refugee, and women trapped in a marriage under a fundamentalist interpretation, we do have to stand up and say something.
That's a great answer, and I think a very, very important distinction to make between respecting why people have faith and that they have faith, and knowing when to stand up and say, that's not right. This is going too far. And those are great examples of when to do that. So I started this podcast for the recently deconverted Christian. What encouragement or piece of guidance can you give them?
Don't give up. And it's okay to have doubts. But remember, there are a lot of people that if you lose your friends and you lose your family over your convictions, they were never really your friends and family to begin with. And that there's a whole lot of other like-minded people out there who will welcome you and be your friends and family if you ask and if you need it.
That's great. So I guess final question is, can you name one resource that you would recommend for someone who's deconverting from Christianity?
The internet. Yeah, there are countless resources online, and the great thing about atheism, I'm using that term for convenience sake, because it's not a movement, it's not organized in any sense, but the great thing about it is that there is no right interpretation of it. It's up to you. But I strongly recommend, for starters, there are a couple of great Facebook groups. The Thinking Atheist is an excellent one. Friendly Atheist is both a website and a Facebook group and a podcast that I strongly encourage. I'm acquainted with their editor, Hemant Mehta. He's a frequent guest on network television, talking about his efforts. He's the author of I Sold My Soul on eBay and The Young Atheist Survival Guide. That's a really excellent community. In particular, is Friendly Atheist. Just Google it. And then the one I brought up earlier, which was why won't God heal amputees? It's a good thought exercise, and you'll find lots more like it as you're exploring. But just read as much as you can. Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris are all fantastic authors for somebody who's just starting to explore the departure from faith. And Steve Wells is another good one. He wrote the Skeptic's Annotated Bible and a few other books more specifically geared toward leaving Christianity.
Yeah, those are some great resources. That's awesome. Well, James, it has been a pleasure getting to know you more. I know we've known each other for a little while now, but this is the first time I've really gotten to hear your story. It was this might sound weird, but it was fun to hear your story.
No, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's great to hear it. And I mean, you went through some real difficult stuff, but in some ways, like some of the things that really stuck out to me were like when you denied the Holy Spirit, all alone in your room, just like, I'm making a point of this, it feels like you said, like that watershed moment,
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just really great hearing it. And I appreciate you taking the time to come onto the podcast and share it with others. 'Cause, I really believe this, that, as we tell our stories, that the people out there who are going through it, what you or I went through years ago, they need this. They need to know that there's people who've gone through it, who've made it out, and who are better for it,
Yeah.
So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next time by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check out our newsletter at bodpodcast.com.